Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of CRNA School Prep Academy. I'm your host, Jenny, and today we are going to be talking about interview styles and what are some variations that are out there. So that way you can maybe better prepare yourself on what to expect. And so I want to start by saying that all schools will have a slightly different style that they partake in. Now, some of them can be similar. But that being said, without knowing, say, an upperclassman to kind of ask, there are sometimes some students really have no idea what they're walking into prior to actually getting to the interview. And so I really encourage you to try to network, try to connect with upperclassmen, current SRNAs, and really try to find out what the interview style is like. A lot of schools will even tell you when you go to the open houses what their interview style is like, and maybe even tell you some questions. I don't really think the vast majority of CRNA school interviews are meant to be that secretive. Don't get me wrong. It's not like they want you to know all the questions you're going to be asked so you can study up ahead of time. And it's very unlikely that you'll ever know that, because even if you did get a few questions that they were going to ask you, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get asked those questions on your test day or on your interview day. And a lot of times they pull from such a big bank of questions that even if the candidate who interviewed right before you gave you a tip on some of the questions, will you be asked that question? You may or may not be. So again, I wouldn't focus so much on the actual questions as I would the style, and trying to then prepare yourself for those types of styles of questions. And so with that being said, let's get into it. So one of the first types of questions that schools will ask you, and most schools will ask this to some extent, even if they tend to hit a heavy clinical style interview, are some personal questions. Now, some programs rely heavily on personal questions and almost exclusively on personal questions. And so that's what I mean. Some schools will just want to get to know you, and some schools will spend just 10 minutes asking you personal questions, while other programs may interview you personally for over a half hour. So it can vary quite a bit based on the school. But personality wise, a lot of these schools are evaluating something called emotional intelligence. So if you have not heard of that, I encourage you to start doing some research on emotional intelligence. There are some free, they call them EQ, emotional intelligence it's the EQ stands for. There are free EQ quizzes out there on the internet. I encourage you to look that up. I also recommend the website 16personalities.com. I have mentioned it here on this podcast before when I was talking with Richard Wilson, who's a faculty member. And again, it's a really great free assessment tool for you to use to kind of evaluate your own personality style and maybe what are some of your weaknesses and what are some of your strengths. So again, I encourage you to check it out. I will put that link in the show notes. But personality wise, they just want to get to know you. They want to know who you are, why you want to pursue anesthesia, what makes you so passionate essentially about pursuing anesthesia. They want to understand that you know what you're getting yourself into. They want to understand that, or want to see that you have a good understanding of what it means to be a CRNA. And so they may ask you, the typical question, why CRNA? Why our program? They could ask you, what do you like to do in your free time? What color is your couch? I mean, they can even throw out random questions like that. So again, they could just be doing various personality style assessments. And a lot of times they're looking to see how kind of insightful you are into your own personality and key attributes, as well as your weaknesses. And then if you have been able to identify your weaknesses, what have you done to overcome those weaknesses, or how are you working on those weaknesses? What is it about your routine and your daily routine that makes you better and apt to deal with problems because you're aware of potential weak points in your own character? So that's what they're looking for in the personality side of things. They're also kind of looking how quickly you can speak on your toes. That's why the random questions exist out there. So I guess it's another style I can point out, is the fact that they could just ask you random questions. Like if you could be any kind of pizza topping, what would you want to be and why? If you could be any kitchen appliance, what would you be and why? I mean, and these questions are not meant to, belittle you or make you feel interrogated. They're kind of just to see how you react under something that's completely off the wall. And also, can you kind of come up on your toes quickly on the spot with a good rationale as to why you want to be a toaster? Or maybe you could say refrigerator because the OR is cold and you like being cold. I mean, again, it's not so much about 100% what you say, but it's more about the rationale you give behind it that is supporting it. And again, just being able to kind of think on your toes off the cuff. The second type of interview style question are clinical based type questions. Now, this can be anything from pathophysiology to pharmacology. So a wide range of clinical style questions. The next kind of variation from this clinical style are scenario clinical based scenarios or questions. So I'll lead into that next, but let's just focus on the pathophysiology pharmacology and how it then can lead into scenario type kind of questions. Pathophysiology could be, tell me about sepsis or tell me about ARDS. And again, they may ask you, what types of patients do you work with in the ICU? And if you mentioned liver failure patients, well, you better understand portal hypertension and the pathway of liver failure and why it causes portal hypertension. And so they're going to test you based on the kind of information you give them. They're going to have you lead the way. So it's really important when you're being asked these clinical questions that you lead into what you're comfortable with. You can really make or break your interview based on how you lead. Be careful what you say if you can't fully explain it. And if you do say it, make sure you can at least try to give some kind of rationale as to support yourself. And it's okay if you don't know, but tell them what you do know. Even if it's very little, you at least want to give them something that shows them that you have some kind of understanding of what you can speak to. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to tell them what you do know. Even if it's wrong, you just do your best, try your best to give them what you think to be accurate. Again, they're just trying to gauge where you're at as far as how in depth is your knowledge currently. But they could ask you, again, those clinical type pathophysiology questions. They could also ask you pharmacological questions, like tell me about Levophed and how does it work? What receptor sites does it work on? Or tell me about famotidine. I mean, they could pick out anything random in there. Octreotide. If you mentioned a liver failure patient, well, do you use octreotide frequently and why? And how does that drug work? So the goal, again, is to try to lead yourself down a pathway that you're comfortable with, that you have at least that you've been working on understanding. And so I really tell everyone, as far as the CRNA interview, is you really shouldn't wait to study for your CRNA interview until after you submit your application for CRNA school. That should not be when you start studying. That is unfortunately when I think the vast majority of people start studying, but I'm trying to give you a heads up tip right now to please not do that, to please use your time in the ICU the entire time to actually study for the interview. I know that seems ridiculous, but trust me, when you do it in small chunks like that, you're going to be building a more comprehensive understanding of what you're doing in the ICU, such that you're not just going to be memorizing for essentially an interview or a quiz. These panels do hundreds of interviews. They can easily decipher the knowledge that's understood versus the knowledge that has been memorized off Google the night before. They can really understand when you're spitting these things out of your mouth, whether it's coming from a place of understanding or whether it's coming from a place of just memorizing. So that's why it's important for you to really take it upon yourself from the day you step foot in the ICU. When you have a patient on certain drips, take some time to look up those drips. I used to print off things all the time in the ICU. Looking back on it, I'm not sure how they felt about me always printing off papers, but it was, if I had any kind of time where I'm like, oh, this is an interesting drip. I've never used milrinone. What is milrinone? I would look it up. I would print it out. Okay, it's a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. I would take those notes with me, and I had a binder, and a study binder that was super thick, that I, had studied over my 2.5 years in the ICU prior to my interview. Did I still get rejected on my first interview? Yes, I did. But I can tell you, going into my second interview, that was extremely heavy pathophysiology pharmacology, and it was rapid fire, that I actually did very, very well in that style interview because I had been studying my pathophysiology pharmacology for a very long time in the ICU. So again, maybe my personal interview skills were not up to par for my first one. That's definitely where I think I had my weak moment, was in the personal type kind of questions. Going forward, if I hadn't gotten into the program I got into, I would have kept going. I would have found a way to improve. I would have rehearsed what I said and how I could say it better. And I would have gone back and I would have tried again. And I would have kept doing so until I got a yes from some school somewhere. So again, persistence is key when it comes to CRNA interviews. Don't let one no deter you. You have to keep going and learn from it. But again, starting early is really the best way I can give you guys to prepare for your CRNA interview. It should be starting from the day you step foot in the ICU. The next type of interview style question that I mentioned was scenarios. And so they can kind of play into pathophysiology pharmacology with scenarios. They can even lead you down an ACLS protocol, you guys, and say, okay, this is your patient. This is the current vital signs. What do you think is going on? And then you can answer that. And they can say, okay, well, now this happened. Now what's happening? Okay, well, now they don't have a pulse. What are you going to do? And again, they could run you through an entire code situation to see, okay, do you know your ACLS drugs? Do you know how to dose them? Do you know how to appropriately treat certain arrhythmias versus cardioversion versus defibrillation? So they could be asking you all these types of questions in a clinical scenario style. They could also ask you scenario style questions that are personality based, meaning they could ask you, tell me about a time you dealt with a difficult coworker and what did you do? Or tell me about a time that you maybe made a mistake in clinical and what did you do? And so again, personal scenario questions and clinical scenario questions can come into play. The third, or it's probably onto the fourth style of interview question is essay and CCRN style test questions. So for these questions, or for this type of style, again, some schools do this, some schools don't, but some schools will give an on-the-spot essay, meaning they'll give you a prompt, an essay prompt, and you have to write a 1-paragraph response to that prompt. And it's, sometimes it's not a prompt that you've ever seen before. Other times, I know some schools will actually send out an article, say a week or two before the interview, and tell you to read it. Maybe they won't tell you why, maybe they will tell you why. So if they don't tell you why and you don't read it, well, you might be in trouble because now the prompt may be based off that article they sent you a week or two ago. They may tell you, read this article, you'll have to write an essay on it during the interview. I don't know whether they're going to tell you or not. Some schools have and some schools haven't. So if they do send you anything like that, tip, hint, read it, make sure you know it by heart, make sure you understand it, and have some concrete ideas of if they were to ask you some kind of on the spot essay that you could come up with something. They could also just completely give you a random prompt that has nothing to do with medicine at all. It could just be completely off the wall, meaning they want to see how well can you organize your thoughts on a topic you're not familiar with at all. And it just, again, goes back to the personality style questions and how quickly you can think on your toes and how you can organize your thoughts when you're kind of put on the spot. And so that's the kind of rationale behind using those types of style interview questions. The next one is a CCRN style test, or an emotional intelligence test. I should mention that too. Some schools are using a test called Casper, and unfortunately, you can't practice it before. But again, it is out there. It's a EQ style, it's an actual EQ test that you can take, or an exam that actually evaluates your emotional intelligence. And again, the CCRN style test is what they call a BKAT test, a basic knowledge assessment test. You can actually look this up. Again, that's BKAT. And I do believe you can actually buy this test online. It does take up to like 2 or 3 weeks to be shipped to your house. So you have to plan ahead for this if you want to see this type of test ahead of time. There's no online format. It's all written format. And again, you have to mail away and send away. I think it's only $20. I think it'd be well worth it if you could plan ahead, far enough ahead to just go ahead and get that test. Might as well, wouldn't hurt anything. And that's a basic knowledge assessment test. From what I've heard, students who have taken it, it is kind of like a smaller version of the CCRN. It's much easier than the CCRN. It's from what I've heard. So kind of like a played down version of it. And I also have, I made kind of like a little CCRN style test inside CRNA School Prep Academy on the resource page. And again, it's just kind of a variation of the CCRN style test. So essentially you could just take a CCRN style book and practice questions, and you should be in good shape, is essentially what I'm telling you to practice. But also keep in mind some schools make up their entire own variation of their CCRN style test. I know my school did. They had basic math calculations. I was even asked head math during my interview. Like if you had a 0.4 milligram per kilo medication and you had a 60 kilo patient, how many milligrams would you give? So again, basic head math on the spot in the interview. So again, knowing some basic math, knowing ratios, percentages, conversions, all that's very important when you go into your CRNA interview. None of it is very hard at all. However, if you're not familiar with it and you're not using it all the time, especially when you're put on the spot, you may come up blank. So I encourage you to look into those things. Again, as a CRNA School Prep Academy student, I have a math course for you. I have plenty of practice questions and an entire long course on how to do ratios, conversions, percentages, all of those things. So please take advantage of that math course. It's under the bonus section inside the Academy. But again, if you have any heads up that you're going to have a CCRN style test, study math on top of CCRN style type information. Other types of questions that could be on a CCRN style type test are like diagrams of, say, like the heart. They could give you a diagram of the heart and say, trace the drop of blood through the heart. And you'd have to, label all the valves, ventricles, all of that. You'd have to, again, trace the blood through the heart. Also knowing the branches that come off the aorta. They sometimes will ask stuff like that to see if people understand the branches that come off the aorta. They also can ask airway. They could show you someone's airway anatomy and ask you to label that. There's all kinds of possibilities. I'm not trying to overwhelm you. I would say to play it safe, stick with some of the things that you routinely do on your unit. Like again, if you're a cardiac nurse, make sure you really thoroughly understand the cardiac system. Everyone, no matter what unit you work in my opinion, you should understand the cardiac system because we all have hearts. And these programs always tend to hit that heavily regardless of what your background is. But most of the time, I would say they try to tailor the interview style to your background. Now, that being said, I have heard programs who maybe ask a neuro nurse cardiac questions, or they ask a cardiac nurse neuro questions. And I think they do that on purpose. I don't know how they couldn't do that on purpose, but it might be to test you how much you know outside your specialty. So really anything's fair game. So again, starting early is key. Anything that's in that CCRN book is fair game, in my opinion, as far as that type of question. So I think I've hit on all the types of questions. And I mentioned random questions. They could just ask you these random questions. And again, it's not really to, belittle you. It's just to kind of see, can you think on your toes? My one friend was asked if she could be any kind of animal, what kind of animal would she be and why? And she said a butterfly because they're pretty and they can fly away. I don't know if that was the answer they were looking for. It makes me laugh every time I think of it. But yeah, so, again, at the end of the day, think about these things, practice them. There are tons of practice questions out there on the internet. We also have a ton inside CRNA School Prep Academy. And it's not that you want to kill yourself, to get everything correct, but it's just being familiar with the types of test questions that you could be asked, and not so you sound rehearsed, but just so you sound like you can have some clear, concise thought. And again, keep in mind when you're thinking of scenario type questions, at least for me, I know it's hard to think back to an actual clinical scenario. I can have ideas of things that happened to me in the past, but it's really hard for me to remember real particular moments. I can pinpoint a few in my anesthesia career, but that's only a few. And I've been a CRNA for 6 years. And these situations that I can think about are usually some pretty big events that happened to me. So, or not even me, like my patient. So again, in my 2.5 years in ICU nurse, I didn't have a whole lot. And so when I'm asked on the spot, tell me about a time you had a disagreement with a coworker, I mean, I really haven't had anything major come up. I'm sure I've had little things, but do I hold on to that? No, I don't. I don't really tend to remember things like that. So I'm encouraging you now to think about things like this. So that way you're making note of that. And so if they are asking you these types of questions, you actually have a concrete story to tell them versus little chunks. And then that's how you dig yourself into a hole. And use the STAR method, which is situation, task, action, and result. If you answer a scenario type question using the STAR method, you will be able to keep the story organized, concrete, to the point. And the most important part, in my opinion, is giving that result or that outcome. So many times people will tell you a story, but they leave that part out. And then it kind of leaves you like hanging like a cliffhanger. And you're like, well, whatever came of it, what was your learning outcome from this situation? And so you really want to make sure you're giving them that versus kind of leaving them hanging. So again, practice the STAR method when you're telling scenario type kind of questions. All right, well, I hope that you guys found that helpful, and good luck to you on your CRNA interviews. I'm rooting for you. We'll see you next week.